recording to the cloud. Okay, so it's recording. You guys can hear me. You guys can see my screen. So I think everything's set up. We have 17 guys here in the call. That's cool. I think throughout the call, some more people are going to join. But anyways, without further ado, let's just get into today's coaching. All right, so as I said, today the idea for us is to cover another league that in my perception is among the biggest ones that humans have compared to GTO, and deviations that they have compared to optimal play, which is the lack of bluff catching, or the lack of, putting enough calls against your opponent's bets, right? And I separated a few solutions here for us to discuss this. And my idea with picking these spots was to highlight situations where I'm pretty sure you are probably missing sufficient calls. And I also try to pick situations where you're very likely to be getting naturally exploited by population. Okay, and this is going to be very important because sometimes you might deviate from optimal play in a way that doesn't cost you too much EV, because your opponents may not be playing GTO in the first place, and they may be even deviating in a direction that makes your deviation the correct adjustment. So sometimes you might even be deviating in a way that naturally exploits your opponents, but the same can happen to you from their perspective. So you could be deviating in a way without knowing that is getting naturally exploited by the way other people are playing compared to GTO. Okay, so I try to pick as well some spots where if you are missing the necessary calls, you're likely going to be getting naturally exploited by population. And I want to make this term very clear. So why don't we start with you guys telling me, how do you perceive this term or this phrase? How would you explain it to someone else? What does it mean to be getting naturally exploited by population? Who wants to take a stab and try to answer this? No one? No one's going to take a stab at answering this. What does exactly mean? What does it mean exactly to be getting naturally exploited by population?
Yes. Oh, I guess that if you are failing to reach like any GTO defense number that you are required to, then if, let's say in this example, if you are folding more than you should, then you are naturally being exploited, right? Like if you're not calling ace 9, ace 10, that stuff. So,
well, not necessarily, right? Because what if your opponent is playing GTO? Then he's not adjusting to your strategy, right? Right? Do you get what I'm saying? So like if you're deviating in a certain way, but you're not getting punished by that deviation, then it's not going to cost you any EV, unless you're making the mistake of, for example, folding a pure strategy call. But that's something we're going to talk about here. That's kind of rare. Usually the mistakes happen in the mixed strategy region. So what I mean by getting naturally exploited is that population is going to be likely deviating in a way that makes your overfold cost you a lot of EV. And the way they do this is unintentionally or sometimes intentionally over bluffing. Okay, so I hope with this first example, this is going to become very clear to you guys. So the first example I separated here is a single raise pot out of position scenario where we are the big blind against the button. So we're on the big blind against the button. The flop is Jack 7 deuce. We check our entire range. There are going to be no donks on this texture. And villain c-bets a quarter pot. Villain is going to be c-betting at a high frequency on this board, given how strong of a board it is for his range. We see here that GTO is mixing both the small and the medium size. In practice, you can pick any one of the two, or if you want, you can mix two. To me, I think just picking one is okay. You don't have to mix two sizes. And then you make the call, and let's imagine you get this turn, which is a 3 of spades turn. When you take a look at the buttons double barrel strategy, you see something very interesting, which is that the IP is required to have a very significant amount of checks with very natural bluffing hands, or at least natural draws in the perception of most people that play poker. So you have a very blank turn. And then with your gut shot region, for example, you're not really allowed to bluff all the time. You have 10-9 checking back over half of the time. You have 10-8 checking around half the time. You have 9-8 checking around 40% of the time. Most of the other bluffs with an overcard are going to be mixed strategies, stuff like king highs. Some other draws here like 5-4, 6-4, 6-5, all having very high frequency of checks as well. So it could happen, and it could happen, and it will happen very often based on my experience and my research on population tendencies. It will happen very often that you are going to be playing against opponents that are always betting these kinds of hands. So they're not really aware, they're not even studying too much these grids, or they are maybe intentionally over bluffing, or they are picking hands that they shouldn't because they haven't studied. So all of the sorts of things could happen here in order for your opponent to be bluffing a little bit too much, bluffing a little bit more often than he is allowed by the solver. David said, isn't Jax better to check? We see here that no, Jax is batting all the time, and it's mostly peaking the 75 sizing. The IP is using two sizes here, the medium and the big, and Jax doesn't want to go with the big too often because it blocks calling range. But no, you shouldn't really be checking Jax here. Well, you should be checking 2% of the time, 3% or whatever. Okay, so you could be playing against many opponents that are going to be over barreling with this region of bluffing hands. And then if you take a look at the big blind's response, you see a defense that is relatively unnatural and uncomfortable for most players. So take a look at this. Every bottom pair is pure calling against this double barrel. So this is against the 3/4 pot size bet. So every single queen deuce, king deuce, ace deuce, 5 deuce, 4 deuce, pure calling versus double barrel. You have mixed frequencies of pocket sixes, pocket fives, pocket fours calling sometimes, and even some ace highs, even some hands as weak as ace 9 offsuit continuing to call the turn. So to me, it's very, very clear that a lot of players, especially at low stakes, players who haven't had enough experience to grid these optimal strategies and solver solutions to know this, and even players that have studied a lot with solvers but don't use RNG in game, it's very easy to just shift these mixed strategies towards pure fold. So maybe the guy knows that he has to call a lot, but with a hand that is very close, he doesn't call 30% of the time. He just folds 100%. He doesn't call 25% of the time with pocket fours. He just folds 100%. He doesn't call 30% of the time or 33% of the time with ace 9 off. He just folds 100%. Now, this type of strategy, this type of leak is going to be getting naturally exploited by a player that over barrels with these natural draws that we saw here, which in my perception, in my experience, based on my research, is definitely the case for most players. So you will be increasing the EV of all those hands by missing calls with that portion of your range. And you're going to be increasing the EV of hands that he's putting in that range way more often than it should. Okay, so this is why missing the proper amount of bluff catches can be very costly to your strategy, because you can be getting naturally exploited by players who are not controlling their frequencies. And even at mid stakes, sometimes even at high stakes, people are not very good at controlling their frequencies. They're going to be using very simple heuristics to construct their ranges. So, well, here I don't have showdown value, I have a draw, so I bet. So every player who doesn't use an RNG is very likely to be over barreling with these kinds of hand strengths, simply because they make a lot of sense to be bet, but we can see that in Solverland, he's not going to be allowed to bluff them all the time. Okay, so this is what I mean with getting naturally exploited by population. Mateo Bounce said, now I totally get what you mean. Awesome. So I was hoping that this second example would make things more clear. So if that's the case, if overfolding a lot of spots can be getting naturally exploited by our opponents, we have to come up with a way to try and avoid this mistake, right? We have to come up with some sort of practical step-by-step process to make sure that we are finding the correct amount of calls. And this is, of course, not very easy since, and we're going to see this in a moment, sometimes it can be very uncomfortable for us to be making calls with hands that have low absolute strength. So for example, making these calls with ace 9, ace 10, sixes, fives, and fours can be very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And there can be also some misconceptions and some wrong beliefs that you have about people that could also be reinforcing this type of play, this type of behavior from your part, which is the classic people don't bluff enough, right? So if you frequent poker forums and if you study with other people, especially at low stakes, you're going to be hearing this every now and then, how people are not bluffing enough and how you should be overfolding, when this is actually not the case in a lot of situations. So you could be using your false belief to justify a play that is probably costing a decent amount of EV. Okay. So let's start by getting some truth here in the chat. Type in the chat if you were aware that you should, for example, always call all deuce X here. Who already knew before I showed this that calling all bottom pairs here was correct? Let's see how you guys are with your current bluff catch strategies. Andrea said, not me. David said, no, I will fold them. Sad face. Buba said, fold 100%. Andreas Johansson said, me neither. Vinicius, not me. Mateo said, definitely not pure calling queen deuce suited. Max said, easy to call deuce X and fours and sixes. Expected them to be at least mixed calls, said Lucas. So yeah, as you guys can see, it's very, very hard, at least in terms of a natural perception for us as humans, to know that all bottom pairs are supposed to be pure calls in these situations. But that's usually what's going to be the case, especially on those boards where you don't have a lot of pairs or a lot of strong draws, right? So on a dry jack 7 deuce board, you're going to struggle to have a lot of very strong hands. So if you start folding the bottom pair region, you are going to become very exploitable since you don't really have other very strong hands to call. And we can see that we're calling pretty much any pair. The ones that are the worst are the ones that are blocking the bluffs and don't have too many outs to improve. We're going to talk about this in a minute. So you prefer calling queen deuce than you prefer calling pocket sixes, for example. So pocket six is going to be blocking a decent amount of bluffs. He has less equity to improve than queen deuce as well. So as you guys already proved here, you probably have a leak in this spot, right? So how to overcome this leak? So give me ideas of how you would approach trying to overcome this leak, or what is a general thought process you have that you think could be beneficial for deciding, do I have to call this hand? Should I not call this hand? Should I fold this hand? Should I call this hand? David said, how about some river? Do we have to call them there deuce X, 3X? We're gonna get there. I separated a river example here for you guys to see as well. But let's try to discuss this. So what are the variables? What are the circumstances that we need to think about and concern ourselves here in order to decide, should I call, should I fold? Or at least, how do you generally approach these call or fold situations? What do you consider when you're deciding whether to make a call or a fold with a bluff catcher. Mateo said, turn c-bet percentage on the HUD. Interesting. That's interesting. We can get into this. Jokura said, river aggression. And if we realize our equity on the river well. Okay. Okay, river aggression. Interesting. What else? What else should we consider when making a decision of calling or folding a bluff catcher? Julius said, how big of a range advantage the IP has on a certain board? Bluff catching ace, king, deuce with the deuce would be worse. Okay, interesting. Krasimir said blockers. Very good. Booba said, how many hands we beat from his range? Hazio said, natural versus unnatural bluffs for villain. As far as my hand selection, blocking value, unblocking bluffs, implied odds on river, improving clean outs. Very good, guys. Very good. So we're going to have to make a very clear distinction between what you guys are saying here, because some of you guys said very good factors to consider, but those are mostly exploitative factors, right? So for example, taking a look at a turn c-bet from the HUD, that's something that you should absolutely do to make a decision. But this is going to be going into a exploitative data point bucket, right? Exploitative data point bucket. River aggression and acrorealization, the same thing, although this also has some merit when it comes to theory as well. You should definitely anticipate in theory, for example, how often villains should be barreling most rivers to decide if you want to call turn or not. But this also goes very heavily on a more exploitative bucket. And then Krasimir said one that is very important. I'm surprised that he was the only one to say this. Blockers are going to be very important for bluff catching decisions. All right. And Hazu said something that is basically the same thing. Hand selection, blocking value, unblocking bluffs, and implied odds. Balazs said, my heuristics is for the spot. The more draw the board offers, the less value bottom pair has, and vice versa. The drier the board is, the more value of paired hand has, meaning MDF. That is generally true. That is generally true. And one of the reasons for this is also that once you have a lot of strong draws on the board, you can call a lot of those draws and you're going to be improving to a lot of strong hands on, let's say you have a double flush draw board. On half of the deck, you're going to have a lot of flushes and a lot of other stuff. So it decreases the necessity for you to be bluff catching with very marginal hands. And also from a different perspective, a lot of your opponent's bluffs are going to have a lot of equity. So those hands are going to lose equity realization on a lot of different rivers. So this is definitely true as a general sense. Right, so we're going to talk about here two things that I think are very important. The first one is a perception of your overall range. Okay, so you have to try and perceive how strong your overall range is, because this is going to help determine whether a certain hand should go into your defense range or not. So for example, in this spot, we absolutely know that we shouldn't ever fold a jack, right? A jack is a very strong hand here. It could even be dominating some of your opponent's value bets. And of course, it's pretty much the top of your range. The strongest hands you're going to have in your range here are going to be Jack X, apart from, of course, some random two pairs and sets that you've made on the turn, which are going to be a limited amount. And then after a Jack, you have a 7, right? So imagine you have called all your Jack X, then the next strongest hands in your range are going to be 7X. Now remember here that button versus big blind, you're going to 3-bet most of your 8s plus pre-flop, so you don't have most of those pocket pairs in your range. You have a slight amount of pocket 8s. So right after Jack X, you have 7X. So 7x is still decently high up in your range. So that's a phrasing that we use in poker to try and put our hand classes in a certain percentile of our range. So 7x is definitely, let's say, on the top 30% of your range here, top 40% of your range here for sure. And then after that, you're going to have the third pairs and fourth pairs. And the third pairs and fourth pairs, not only they are decently still high up in the range, although already getting to the middling part, but they have very good blockers, right? So they block sets and two pairs from your opponent's range. And they have also 5 outs to improve to very strong, either two pair or trips, right? So these pairs on the board, they are very strong for that reason. They block your opponents, some of your opponents' value bets, and they also get to improve to very strong two pairs or trips by the river. So you also end up calling them very often. Okay, so first of all, try to always get a very clear perception of how your overall range looks. If you have a biased perception of how your overall range looks, it's very easy to justify just, I'm going to fold this hand because it's too weak or because it's at the bottom of my range. But is it really in the bottom of your range? How many more strong hands do you have? How do you construct your flop check raising strategy? Aren't you going to be fast playing a lot of your strong hands on the flop? So all of this is very important for you to don't make the mistake of just justifying pure folds because this is in the bottom of your range. Okay, so perception of your range is very important. And then right next to it is going to be your blockers. So now that you know that you should be calling a lot on the turn versus double barrel, let's take a look at a river spot. And I hope I clicked on the right. Okay, yeah, so I selected the button strategy so that you don't get to see our defense strategy. So imagine you face the 3/4 bet on the turn, you called, and the river is a queen, okay? The river is a queen. We see here that the IP has the option to bet multiple sizes. Block bet is never used, but he gets to use some half pots, some 3/4, some 1.5x overbets, and even some all-in shoves. Now, my question to you guys here is going to be, against this medium size, the 77% pot bet, what do you guys think is the bottom of our calling range? What is the weakest hand we should call on the river here? It could be a mixed strategy, of course. We don't have to call it all the time. But what do you think should be the weakest hand we should call on the river here versus a 77% bet? Let's see who can guess the closest here. Max said king deuce, Chakov said ace deuce, Lucas said ace 3. Arthur said some best 3x with good blockers. Well, come on, Arthur, that's too easy, right? So give us, what are those best blockers? Andreas said king deuce. Krasimir said king deuce. So everyone putting, or most of you putting your money into the king deuce, being the weakest hand we call. Who else? Arthur said blocker ace 3, king 3. Okay. All right. So those are mostly good guesses. And you're going to see here in the solution that we're going to have to call some of those hands. So you see here ace 3 suited calling around, if you disregard the suits, of course, calling around 80% of the time. Ace deuce, if you disregard the suits, calling around 60% of the time, I would say, based on this grid. Okay, but king deuce, king 3 that a lot of you said should be called is never getting called. So why is king deuce never a call and ace deuce very frequently a call? Why is that? We call ace deuce 60%, so majority of the time. Ace 3 we call 80%, almost pure, whereas king 3, king deuce we absolutely never call. King X blocks his bluffing range, said the V or David. Lucas said king 3, king deuce blocks some king X bluffs. Yes, that's the correct answer, but both of you, if I'm not mistaken, no, Lucas said ace 3, and David didn't answer, it seems. So yes, that's the correct answer, which some of you didn't think about, right? So villain isn't going to be barreling too much with ace high on a jack 7 deuce 3 board from the turn already, right? So villain is going to be bluffing the turn way more often with the king than with an ace. And once he gets to the river, some ace X might still have some showdown value because the big blind was calling ace 10 and ace 9 on the turn. So some ace highs from villain might still be chopping on the river and they may not bluff. So a king is a very, very harmful blocker to have here because it's going to block a lot of the imposition players' bluffs. Okay, so we can take a look at that here in the buttons range construction. We see that villain is bluffing with a lot of king highs. So we see king 9, king 6, king 5, king 4, all bluffing at a very high frequency by the AP player, whereas almost no hands that are bluffing contain an ace. So a7 was middle pair gets checked. A6 and ace5 bluffed sometimes on the turn, but they're now pure checking the river. So villain almost never has an ace when he bluffs the river, apart from exactly ace 4. So ace 4 is the only bluffing hand that contains an ace from the AP player. And that's why in our bluff catching range construction, we're going to try and avoid having a king. So we never call king 7, we always call ace 7. We never call king 3, we almost always call ace 3. So you can see how trying to perceive your opponent's bluff range construction is going to be very important to have proper bluff catching hand selection. Okay, so this is extremely important. Don't treat any hand as if they were the same, because the EV of calling hands with different blocker properties is going to be different. So if we take a look at calling with king 3, for example, take a look at king 3 of clubs. King 3 of clubs is losing 2 big blinds every single time it calls. Now, it might not seem like 2 big blinds is a lot, but it's a very, very negative call, considering that you're going to be playing this spot very often and bluff catching on the river very often. Okay, so losing 2 big blinds every time you make the call should be very, very bad for you. Hazu said, do you think it's reasonable to assume field is bluffing king 6, king 4, king 5? I assume some guys might miss those as they're not natural people and actually barreling ace 4, ace 5, which therefore would shift our bluff catchers to king X instead of ace X. I think that is possible, especially for people very inexperienced with solvers. But I would say most regs at 500 and above are going to be very aware that you should bluff king 6, king 5, king 4 before ace 4, ace 5. Okay, so I would say don't try to shift your strategy to try and counter people that don't know what they're doing, because as you move up in stakes, you're going to be playing against tougher opposition, right? So it's possible that this would happen, but I would say don't waste too much energy trying to come up with a specific counter against this type of player. So considering your blockers is super important. And in order to think about your opponent's blockers, you have to think about, or you have to, first of all, study these grids to know how the proper bluff range construction should look like, and then look at your bluff catchers and try to make sense of whether they are good blocker or they have good blocker effects or bad blocker effects, right? So we have here, for example, a hand like 9-7 is never calling. So this might indicate that the AP should be bluffed with a decent amount of 9 highs here. So let's take a look here. So villain is bluffed with a hand like king 9, for example, king 9 off. Remember always that the offsuit combos are going to account for a lot more combos than the suited combos. So these are going to be very significant in terms of blocker effects. So villain is bluffing with a 9-8, bluffing with 10-9, and bluffing with king 9. So having a 9 here is also not very good. And then having an ace, as we said, is very good. So if you can identify what are the best blockers to have and what are the worst blockers to have, it's likely that you're going to be, it's likely that you're not going to be making a very big mistake. And then you have some other hands that are neutral, right? So if you have 7-5, a 5 is not very present in your opponent's bluffing range. So you mostly unblock bluffs, but it doesn't have any decent blocker effects to make it a pure call. So you just mix. And we see here that we need to have a raising range. Of course, we improve to queen jack in the spot where against the sizing, we completely dominate that range. So we should be shoving our queen jack, and we need to balance that queen jack with some bluffs. And those bluffs are going to come from the jack X region. So the jack X is going to be the best